From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. I am Ben Hall. We're taking on an important, big, and tough topic tonight. So, it's one of the major issues in the presidential election. We're talking about ISIS and terrorism. How are we doing in the war on terror? And this can be measured in many ways. Of course, we're seeing these attacks all around the world. ISIS claims responsibility for them. All the while, we have increased airstrikes against ISIS. Some 50,000 bombs have been dropped over the course of 2 years in 4 different countries. So the question tonight, how are we doing? We're happy to have with us Dr. Mark Swart, political science professor at Lipscomb University. Thank you for being with us.
Sure, Ben.
Thank you very much. All right, so I pose the question to you.
Okay.
Overall, how are we doing?
I think when you're looking at dealing with something like ISIS, you have to look at it at several different levels. It's a multi-dimensional threat. It is both an idea and a state. It is both a terrorist group and also a legitimate army in that area. And so when we're saying how are we doing against that threat, we are having to look at it from several different angles. It's not like the classic battlefield progress that you'd find in a World War II or something like that. It's even harder to gauge progress against something like ISIS than it was to gauge progress against the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese when it came to the Vietnam War. And if you remember, one of the key things about the Vietnam War was when people talked about progress, they would use body counts, they would use things like, how much tonnage had been dropped on North Vietnam. And in the end, the consensus became that those things really didn't carry the tide or really gauge what the actual thing was, because it's both a political battle as well as a military battle. And that's even more true, I think, of ISIS. ISIS is not an unparalleled sort of threat or anything like that, or an existential threat to the United States per se, but it is something that is difficult to contain and it is difficult to understand, and therefore is difficult to measure progress in a really cohesive way.
So it's a group and it's an idea.
Yes.
That is very interesting. And what I read, we have dropped, as I said, 50,000 bombs. We've killed, according to what I read, 25,000 ISIS fighters over the course of 2 years.
Right.
25,000. Yet, I think a lot of people feel like we're not winning, that we're losing ground.
Right. Because again, if you can't put a number on it, if you've got nothing to compare it to, it becomes difficult for people to understand what does that number mean? Because a statistic doesn't really speak for itself. We have to interpret it. And without good interpretation, meaning having a good comparison, having a good way of understanding things, we really have no way of communicating to people, hey, we have done things better. There is progress being made. And also, in the midst of a presidential election, in the midst of our partisan atmosphere that we have, it's really difficult to get anyone to agree that that progress is being made, even as all sides would like to see progress.
So we started airstrikes 2 years ago. Here we are 2 years later.
Right.
Has the territory, we've increased the countries in which we're doing airstrikes.
Sure.
Has their hold, as far as territory, increased?
Their hold on territory has actually decreased. Progress has been made both in the northern parts of Iraq and also in the northern parts of the Syrian, what is Syria, next to the Turkish border. But most of what has been given up, or what has been sort of left behind by ISIS, has been areas that were hard for them to defend. And so progress has been made, but you could also make the argument that where they've sort of consolidated themselves, which is where they seem to really be difficult to root out. Because what we're looking towards, especially in the fall, is it looks like a couple of very tough fights against urban environments. And one thing that military people will definitely tell you is an urban house-to-house, street-to-street type fight is probably the most difficult that you can have in terms of lives lost, in terms of damage made, and also sort of what we like to do is do a fight on the cheap. We want them to die, we don't want our people to die.
When you see these terrorist attacks, ISIS will claim responsibility.
Yes.
And it will be someone who often they were unemployed or on the fringes of society, and then they cling to this idea of ISIS.
Sure.
So the question is, and I've seen, obviously there's radical Islamic terrorism.
Okay.
They've embraced, radical Islam.
Right.
How religious are they, and how much of something else are they?
Well, that's probably the key point to what we don't know and what we do know. We can see some things on the surface, being able to predict who's going to become that person, because there's, like you say, the testimony from people who knew them. Well, this isn't a very religious person, or this is someone who wasn't observant at all of religious beliefs or anything, but all of a sudden they do something extremely devoted to this idea. And let's again, radical Islam is a particular interpretation of that religion that what they're doing is something that is almost wholly unpredictable in terms of how do they get radicalized. We talk about online, we talk about what happens in terms of psychology and things like this. And we know a few things about the type of people who do this. Like you say, the people on the fringes, those who are being kind of maybe discriminated against, maybe have some sort of behavior, maybe they even have been a low-level criminal of some sort. Maybe what sort of gets them to do this is my way to redemption or something like that. Again, but it's a difficult thing to kind of like say, what triggered it? What actually is the tipping point? What actually moves somebody in that direction? Because we know that there are also so many different ways that someone can be reached.
Sure. With social media now, there's so many ways people can be reached.
Sure. And also think of all the people who are in that same position. Someone who may have grown up in that religion, who went down a path of maybe petty crime or drug use or something like that, and simply became a respectable citizen. I mean, those sorts of things happen all the time as well.
And what we see in this campaign is, those who say we need to be tougher on ISIS. What does that look like? So we've increased the countries in which we do airstrikes,
right.
and we've done airstrikes. How do we get tougher? Are we talking ground troops, or what are we talking about?
Let's remember, we already do have ground troops there. We're calling them advisors. It's mostly special forces. These are troops who are specially trained for these types of things. They lead and advise Iraqi troops. They are helping with the Kurds. They are helping with various Libyan groups. We do have troops in all of those countries that you're talking about. It's just not in large numbers. And what they are doing more than anything is also, again, it's a political role as well as a military role. Those who advocate a military solution would like a lot of those political restraints, a lot of those political considerations either taken off or moved to a secondary sort of role as opposed to being the primary focus. And that means letting them loose in terms of, the military just, okay, go in, do what you need to do. But that has all sorts of complications to it, especially in a place like Syria, a country that is a place of major power contest. Russia, Iran, Turkey, United States, the European Union in a place like Libya, also again with the United States, and then also complex local situations where we're not really sure what we want to do in terms of putting it back together. Libya is probably the best example of that. Afghanistan is probably the most well-known example of that, where local politics, local relationships, local groups, clans, tribes, whatever you want to call them, are an important part of the local context.
When airstrikes started 2 years ago, I wonder if President Obama had said, within 2 years, we will be bombing in 4 different countries. We will have dropped this number of bombs, we will have done this, this, and this, that people would have gone, okay, yes, let's do it. It seems like it's kind of been a creep, almost.
It's very incremental.
It's been a slow sort of thing, and I don't know that people know that we're bombing in 4 different countries, and that we've done all of this. And still, people say it's not enough. And so where does this lead?
Well, that's a good question. It either leads to sort of this slow grind, which seems to be almost not really making any progress, but also not losing any ground. But ISIS is just like any other political force, political group. They have an ability to grow, but they also have an ability to lessen in strength and things like that. Like the United States, like Turkey. I mean, Turkey's gone now through a coup, which we've seen. Russia's going through a lot of difficulties itself. Right now they're stamping around a lot on the international stage, but they're also very vulnerable in many ways, especially economically, which eventually leads to your military strength, which eventually leads to your political strength. So this is something that can go in a lot of different directions. Because again, we're not willing to, at this point, commit fully to it. Because if we do, that means we take complete responsibility for it.
We kind of don't know what to do. We're in this kind of
because again, we
area
don't want
we
to
don't
take
know. What to
we
do.
don't want to take responsibility for rebuilding Syria, as opposed when we already have Iraq and Afghanistan kind of still on our plate.
All right, so we have several callers on the line. I want you to hold on the line. We're about to go to break, and then we'll come back and we'll start taking callers. Before we go to break, I want to ask you one other question.
Okay.
Russia's role in all of this. Are Russia and ISIS friend or foe?
Foe.
So
Russia is
again,
very...
then we don't like ISIS. Russia doesn't like it. It seems like we should find...
Right, but we made a very clear position at the very beginning of this, which was the Assad government in Syria is something that we cannot tolerate anymore. We backed off on that a little bit, and I think we are getting to a point where maybe Assad is able to stay in power. But if you remember, 4 years ago, we were saying Assad needs to go, the red line when it came to the use of chemical weapons, and all of that says no negotiation, no backing off. We're doing that now, and with a new president, we can do that more easily because it's not part of President Obama's administration. But with Russia, they have a huge problem with their security along their border around all of them, and their main concern is Islamic terrorism. And so that's where they see they'd rather fight Islamic terrorism, ISIS, in Syria than they would on their own border.
All right, so we're going to take a break. That kind of sets the table. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. If you're on the line, hold on. We will take your call. I'll be back right after this.